They were founded in 1622, when Louis XIII provided some of his light cavalrymen with muskets. And these troops, called Musketeers, formed a royal guard for the king when he was outside the royal residence, and they wore a tabard upon which had been embroidered a white cross. It indicated that they belonged to the king. Well, eventually they were disbanded, but then along came Alexander Dumas. Dateline 1844. The March 14th edition of Le Cycle, which was a very prominent French newspaper, published the first installment of a new story by Alexander Dumas. It was a hit from day one, and eventually published as a book, and also followed by 2 sequels. So, show of hands, who doesn't know the story? Well, the book relates the tale of D'Artagnan as a gallant young warrior, and his adventures along with the Musketeers, specifically with Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Here's a picture of a first edition of the Three Musketeers. It sold for $40,000 at an auction. Or you can get a used paperback book like this for a matter of pennies. Within just 2 years, it was translated several times into English. The most famous version was by a fellow named William Barrow, and most of the popular editions, even today, use his translation from 1846. The first movie about the Three Musketeers was in 1921, and it starred Douglas Fairbanks, the king of the swashbucklers. Oh no. Over the course of the past 100 years, the Three Musketeers has found its way to film in many, many different forms. And I mean many different forms. Animation. I think we're all familiar with some of these characters. And there were many comic book versions. The first one actually in the 1880s. Even some of those cartoon characters. And of course there were board games and card games, which is why we're here after all. Now in the 1830s in Germany, there was a game produced that was called Assalto, or The Siege. And I did a whole video on Assalto already, so you can look that up. The link's in the show notes here. And that game was published throughout the 19th century. And in 1915, a fellow with the impressive name of Helmuth F.C. Duberg actually got a patent on that game system, on that board design, here in the United States. I'm not sure how he managed that. By that time, it must have been in the public domain. But he did, nonetheless. And in 1925, Milton Bradley published a game called The Royal Guardsman, and he used the same Assalto board, but they didn't acknowledge Mr. Duberg in there at all. But 2 years later, they changed the name to The Three Musketeers. Undoubtedly a marketing decision because it was a better-known name, and they continued to publish this game for decades. This is a 1950 version of that game. But there are also more original games based on the Musketeers after a while. In 1969, world-famous game designer Sid Saxon came out with a book, which should be on everybody's shelf, by the way, in some edition or another. It was called A Gamut of Games. My copy looks like this. The original edition looked like that. And in that book, he describes 38 games, some originals and some more or less traditional games. And one of those is called The Three Musketeers. It was designed by a Canadian game designer called Haar Hoolim, and it goes like this. This is a 2-player abstract strategy game with a board of 25 spaces. One player gets 3 pegs, the Three Musketeers, and the other gets 22 pegs, which are simply called the enemy. Not sure if that's Cardinal Richelieu's guards, but that would be logical. The Three Musketeers are set up like this, one in the center and the other 2 on opposite corners. The enemy gets all the other spaces. The Musketeers always move first. And that movement is one space orthogonally into a space occupied by an enemy peg. the enemy peg is removed from the board. Enemy can move any peg one space orthogonally to any vacant space. The players have different win conditions, different objectives in the game. The Musketeers win if there is no move available. Here's what a Musketeer win might look like. There are no enemy pieces left that can be captured. The enemy, on the other hand, must play a very cutthroat game, moving their pieces into sacrificial positions to force the Musketeers to move about the board. Ultimately, the enemy player wins if they can get all three Musketeers into the same row or into the same column. As soon as the Musketeers move into this configuration, the game is over and the enemy wins. And that's the game. Now, Sid Sackson, in his infinite wisdom, suggested that points be awarded for the condition at the end of the game, how many enemy pieces are still on the board, or how many moves it took. There's a couple different methods. He suggested that you'd play a series of games and then see how the cumulative score stacks up. I guess he suspected that there was a first-player advantage going on. He illustrates a couple sample games move by move in the Gamut of Games book. I leave it to you if you'd like to try some of those scoring methods. I just like the game for what it is, a quick little strategy game for two. As I say, there have been a number of games with the Three Musketeers theme, traditional war games, simulation games. It seems logical that because they were in service for almost 100 years that they would be included in some of the period war games. In 1991, a card game called Musketeer was published. According to the box, it says, "In the Queen's service, the Musketeers are trying to acquire 3 valuable gems. However, the Cardinal and his dreaded guards are out to sabotage the Musketeers' mission. The most successful Musketeers will be awarded gems. Those who fail will be sent to prison and will remain empty-handed." Versions were published by Pegasus Spiel, Hex Games, and most recently, Eagle Gryphon Games. Now, in 2007, a movie came out called In the Name of the King. It had nothing to do with the Musketeers. But I found a 2004 board game that was called The Three Musketeers in the Name of the King. And it says it's the official movie board game. Well, it looks like the movie that it's tied to is actually something else. Lost in translation, I suppose, because it's a French movie, part of a series, in fact, and it's a French game published by Blam. Blam is affiliated with a series of games called the Cartaventura series. It sounds Italian to me, but I guess it's French. And this is one of them. I just happen to have this one. It's called Vinland. But they're all little card games that are more or less choose-your-own-adventure type games. There's a series of 14 of them to date. A lot of different themes to them. 2 of the Cartaventura games are affiliated with this movie and its sequel. In 2009, a game was published called The Queen's Pendant. The Three Musketeers, The Queen's Pendant. And that must have been a pretty big hit, too. It went on to be published in several different languages by several different companies, including Russian, English, German, Dutch, and French, and maybe more. And an expansion was even offered as well. I might have to look this one up. The box says, "The players take the role of the Musketeers and move through the castle to find the Queen and return her jewels. One player takes up the role of Richelieu and the guards. It's their task to find which Musketeer is carrying the jewels and defeat them. It's one against all and all against one." Hey, that sounds like a pretty good battle cry. All for one, one for all. In 2011, a chess variant was devised called Musketeer Chess. The game is set up like traditional chess, but each player has 2 additional Musketeer characters, and they set up off the board behind the back row of their pieces, but affiliated with one column of pieces. Once that space on the edge of the board becomes vacated, these Musketeer pieces move into play, and they're very powerful pieces. Sounds kind of interesting if you're into chess variants. In 2014, another game about the Musketeers and the Queen's jewels was published, and that one is more of a social deduction game where you're trying to figure out who's the good guys, the bad guys, who has the jewels and who doesn't. It was billed as a 24-card micro game for 4 to 8 players. If you like that sort of thing, you can find out information on BoardGameGeek.com. Meanwhile, try that little strategy game there from Sid Sackson's book, and let me know what you think. If you'd like to try the Assalto version, the Siege, we have a version of that in our catalog, so go on over to the New Venture website and check out Assalto. And you can call it Three Musketeers if you like. There are variations of Assalto that use from 2 to 7 officers, and you can easily play it with 3 musketeers. And there are plenty more where that comes, so you got no excuse. Be sure to play every day. In 1932, a company called Mars Wrigley introduced a candy bar called Three Musketeers. Ever heard of it? They were made with 3 different flavored fillings, of vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate, like Neapolitan ice cream. And that's why it was called Three Musketeers. The flavors changed in 1945. That's when they came up with the one type of vanilla filling that they have today. They've tried different flavors over the years, but that one survives. And I like it.